So yes, importantly, carrying capacities can change. So just because, there's a number that can be sustained in a particular environment at one time, that can go up or it can go down depending on the conditions of that environment. So for example, let's say we're talking about like harbor seals in a kelp forest. And let's say their limiting resource is food. There's just not enough sardines to go around if there's too many harbor seals. So their carrying capacity, again, let's say it's like a 50. And the limiting resource is sardines. Let's say suddenly the sardines have way more food available. So they breed like crazy, and suddenly there's more sardines to go around. Now suddenly the harbor seal's like, oh, there can actually be more of us around now because there's more food to go around. So their carrying capacity would go up. They'd be able to have a larger population size. On the other hand, let's say like a disease goes through all the sardines and like kills a bunch of the sardines off, then the carrying capacity of harbor seals would go down because now there's like even less food than usual to go around, and so you can't sustain 50 harbor seals in that kelp forest anymore. Maybe you can only sustain 30 in that kelp forest, so the carrying capacity would go down. Or maybe a new sea lion. There were no sea lions there before, and sea lions show up, and now the sea lions, the harbor seals, are competing for the same sardines. Then also the carrying capacity is going to go down because now they have competition for those sardines. Evolution can be another thing that can cause a change in carrying capacity. Maybe the harbor seals over many generations evolved to need fewer calories, and so they each don't need to eat as many sardines. And again, the carrying capacity could go up. So yeah, a lot of different things can cause carrying capacities to change in an environment. Now, in general, when we're talking about a population, it's not as if, say the harbor seals, they're having babies and suddenly look around and be like, oh, wait, there's 50 of us. That means we have to stop having babies. That's not what harbor seals are doing. Instead, so populations don't actually just like hit the carrying capacity and then just like stay, straight on that line. What actually happens is something a little more like this, where they tend to overshoot their carrying capacity, then like extra die because there's not enough of whatever the limiting resources to go around. So then they tend to kind of go under the carrying capacity. Now there's like extra to go around. So then they kind of go over the carrying capacity, under it, over, under. So they kind of fluctuate around the carrying capacity. So often the actual population dynamic will look a little bit like this. Um, and you can also get fluctuations or population cycles yearly. So, like you could have more in the spring, fewer in the winter, or decadal. So, things like El Nino or La Nina can cause these regular population cycles. The last thing I'm going to talk about ecology is larval ecology, because this is very important in the oceans. Because many, 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 in fact, most marine organisms spend some time as larvae. uh, where they are often smaller. They're often planktonic, like a lot of them are planktonic. And they can often look really, really different from their adult forms too. So, like crabs, for example, most of them are born from eggs as zoea, which are these little kind of spiky balls that are part of the plankton. And then they grow into megalops, and then they grow into adult crabs. They actually go through several metamorphoses. But for the beginning of their lives, they are these teeny tiny little zoea floating around as part of the plankton. Also, for most species that have larvae, they produce hundreds to thousands to tens of thousands of larvae, and only a very small percentage of those actually make it to adulthood. So it might be hard to see here, but this person has like a handful of crab zoea. So sometimes you'll be in areas where the plankton are just, the ocean's like filled with crab zoea, but most of those do not become adult crabs. Most of them do not make it to adulthood. So, what can influence success when it comes to larval ecology? There's a few different things. First is a critical period. This is a phenomenon we see where there seems to be a certain time period as an organism is growing up where they have to find the correct food source. And if they get it, then they're much more likely to reach adulthood. And if they don't get it, they are going to die out. A lot of these we talk about, especially in fisheries, because again, a lot of fish start as larvae. Most of them start out as eggs. They're like this big. Even like tuna fish, swordfish, they start out this big. And then they grow up into tuna fish and swordfish. But there's a period of their lives where they're these teeny tiny little things that are part of the plankton. And so if we, want there to be more tuna because we like to catch tuna and eat tuna and they're economically important, we need to understand the time period where we go from, tens of thousands of tuna to like five tuna, right? This is the time period where we're going from tons of larvae to just a few adults. So understanding what is influencing how many of those larvae end up becoming adults can be really important for things like fisheries. So critical period, the time where those larvae have to find a food resource. For example, many fish start with basically an egg yolk attached to them that they can use as a food source while they're, in their plankton form. But then that yolk gets used up. And at that point, they have to like find the correct food source or they're just going to starve and die. So knowing kind of what that critical period is and like what food source they need to find can be helpful. Larval duration can influence success, like how long a species spends as like part of the plankton, part of the larva. Favorable currents, because again, a lot of them are plankton, so they're going to go wherever the currents go. So if the currents bring them to a good location, then they will likely more of them will live. And if they bring them to a bad location, like they just dump them out in the open ocean, and that's not where they're supposed to be, then likely all of them will die. So some plankton actually use vertical migrations, going up and down vertically to like find the correct currents that are going to bring them to where they want to go. For example, a gag grouper are this very delicious, frankly, species of fish that lives off of Florida. And what they do is when they are babies, they actually migrate down because those are the currents that are going towards the shelf, towards like land, basically. And they ride these little currents to places like estuaries, seagrass beds, which are like their ideal habitat to go from like this big to like this big, basically. But then once they're this big, now they're at the right size where they need more food and they can survive in like deeper waters. Then they migrate back out from the nursery habitat and onto these deeper reefs. So this is an example of them using vertical migration to like kind of ride the currents to where they want to go. And another one is like locating favorable habitat. Like if you are a little tiny barnacle larva, you have to find, an empty space on a rock somewhere to attach where there will be food for you. So finding a favorable habitat. Now, we call this process where young individuals go from often being larvae to finding the correct habitat and entering the adult population. We call that recruitment. So, for example, we're talking about fisheries. We'll say an individual recruits to the fishery. They become large enough that they're like part of the fishery. But this applies again for like little baby larval barnacles attaching to a rock and becoming an adult barnacle. They are recruiting to that habitat. Now, as I mentioned, there's often substantial year-to-year variation in recruitment. Some years, again, if we're talking about like a fishery, some years you'll have like 10,000 individuals joining, the adult population, and maybe another year you only have 5,000 individuals joining the population. And again, it can be pretty important both to be able to predict that and to know like why that's happening if you want to know how much you can fish without overfishing. So again, very important to understand why we have year-to-year variation. Also, different species target different cues as to know like where to recruit to if we're talking about like a habitat. Some of them use scent, some of them use sound. For example, when it comes to fish recruiting to reefs, like which as they're floating around the water as little tiny fish, picking which reef they want to like stick with and grow up at. They found that actually the sound of pistol shrimp on coral reefs helps like attract baby fish to a reef. So there was actually a project they did where they were trying to basically create a new coral reef in an area, and they were able to like kind of plant these corals, but like no fish were showing up, and fish are actually a very important part of like a healthy coral reef. So they actually started playing the sound of like pistol and snapping shrimp in order to like attract fish to the new reef, and it worked. Um, and again, helpful to know what is most important for a particular species. Is it currents? Is it food? Is what kind of habitats available, etc. So you can also do studies about where a species is recruiting from. Because some species they self-recruit, meaning that like say again, let's say we're talking about a coral species, right? So let's say staghorn coral. If for Coral also has a planktonic larvae, so they throw eggs and sperm up the air. They become little larvae, and the larvae, again, kind of similar to barnacles, have to like find a little piece of rock to attach to then grow into an adult coral. So you can look at which coral populations are feeding and which are seeding and which are self-recruiting. So this is a piece of the Solomon Islands, and for example, if you look right here in zone three, you can see zone three is 19% of the new corals are self-recruited, meaning that they came from corals that were already in that area. So the corals, made babies, and those babies recruited back onto that same reef. 19% of the corals there were also, uh, larvae there. But for example, here you can see in this area, 21% of the corals on this reef actually were made by this reef. So this reef, eggs, sperm, little larval babies, and they traveled and recruited to the reef over here. So that's really important to know because, for example, if you want to know, hey, this reef's declining, why is that happening? Is it a problem? It could be a problem here. So maybe there's pollution, maybe there's overfishing here, but there also could be a problem here. Because again, in order to get new corals, this place has to be healthy because a lot of the corals here are coming from over here. So there also could be a problem in zone two. So you're not getting any seeding recruits coming from there. So again, that's another thing you can study as a marine biologist is if we're talking about, larval, we also call this larval supply. Where are your larvae coming from? How much of them are like me? Are they born in the same area? Are they born really far away? How are they getting here? All of this stuff's really good to study when you're a marine biologist because so many of our marine species start out as planktonic larvae. That's about it for today. Of course, you have the study guide at the end of the slides. I will see you all on Friday, and I hope you have a great week.